Ambassador Helms was serving as the CIA Deputy Director for Plans at the time of the Kennedy assassination. As such, he was responsible for the Directorate of Plans, which was the office engaged in covert operations. In 1964, Ambassador Helms was the CIA official who worked with the Warren Commission on a day-to-day basis, and he testified before the Commission on May 14, 1964. Ambassador Helms was appointed Director of Central Intelligence in 1966, serving in that capacity until 1973. In 1973, he was named Ambassador to Iran. At present, Mr. Helms is a business consultant here in Washington. It would be appropriate at this time, Mr. Chairman, to call Mr. Helms.
Committee calls Ambassador Helms.
Do you recall specifically whether there was any disagreement in the handling of the Nosenko case?
I don't recall any disagreement about the so-called handling of the Nosenko case. There was I believe, a different interpretation as to what Nosenko represented. It was my impression that the FBI had passed on what Nosenko had to say about Lee Harvey Oswald to the Warren Commission at exactly the way Nosenko had given it to them, and at a later date it was necessary to point out to the Warren Commission that the bona fides of Mr. Nosenko had not been established.
Did the agency pay particular attention to the area of foreign conspiracy? You made reference to Soviet involvement and Cuban involvement. Was that your primary focus?
That was obviously the matter of prime concern. And since Nosenko was in the agency's hands, this became one of the most difficult issues to face that the agency had ever faced. Here, a president of the United States had been murdered, and a man had come from the Soviet Union, an acknowledged Soviet intelligence officer, and said that his intelligence service had never been in touch with this man and knew nothing about him. This strained credulity at the time. It strains it to this day.
Was all information pertinent to the Warren Commission's work promptly given to the Warren Commission, Mr. Helms?
I don't know how to answer that question, Mr. Goldsmith. I thought that we made a major effort to be as cooperative and prompt and as helpful as possible. But in recent years, I've been through enough to recognize that you can't make a flat statement against anything. So I don't know. Maybe there were some places where it wasn't as prompt as it should have been, but I'm not in a position to identify them. But I don't believe we held anything back. On January 23, 1964 in Geneva, that's in Geneva, Switzerland, Mr. Yuri Nosenko requested that he be permitted to defect to the West. Mr. Nosenko's request was accompanied by a claim that he could give a comprehensive report on Lee Harvey Oswald's contacts and connections with the KGB during Oswald's stay in the Soviet Union between 1959 and 1962. It is difficult to overstate the significance that Yuri Nosenko's defection assumed in the investigation of President Kennedy's assassination. If Mr. Nosenko turned out to be a bona fide defector, if his information were to be believed, then we could conclude that the KGB and the Soviet Union had nothing to do with Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963, and therefore had nothing to do with President Kennedy's murder. If, on the other hand, Mr. Nosenko had been programmed in advance by the KGB to minimize KGB connections with Oswald, if Mr. Nosenko was giving us false information about Oswald's contacts with the KGB in 1959 to 1962, it was fair for us to surmise that there may have been an Oswald-KGB connection in November 1963. More specifically, that Oswald was acting as a Soviet agent when he shot President Kennedy. If it were shown that Oswald was in fact acting as a Soviet agent when he shot President Kennedy, the consequences to the United States of America, and indeed to the world, would have been staggering. Thus it became a matter of the utmost importance to this government to determine the bona fides of Mr. Yuri Nosenko. I was rather puzzled by some of Mr. Hart's testimony the other day before this committee. He seemed to go into lurid detail about Nosenko's treatment, but when it came time to make his contribution to the purposes of the committee hearing, in other words, what Nosenko knew about Oswald, he had no clarification to make and nothing to contribute. And yet he was here as the official representative of the Director of Central Intelligence, as I understand it. It was almost as though his purpose was to use his testimony before this committee to excoriate some of his former colleagues for their handling of the Nosenko case. In any event, I never heard of the note alleged to have been handwritten by the, quote, deputy chief of the Soviet Bloc Division, unquote, using such sensational terminology as, quote, liquidate the man, unquote, commitment to a loony bin, unquote, etc., etc. These options were never presented to me, were never entertained by me, were never considered. The problem was to resettle Mr. Nosenko in American society, and this is what the agency did. And the other assertions are false as far as I personally am aware. And I would not like to see perpetuated on indefinitely into the history of this country that there was any consideration given by senior officials of the agency to those options that were identified in this lurid handwritten memorandum. I don't know how the thing happened to get written. I don't know how it happened to be held in the files. I don't know how it happened to be part of Mr. Hart's role to bring it down here. But in any event, I want to put to rest once and for all that this was never considered.
You knew you had an important issue on your hands, didn't you?
Certainly.
And it was extremely important by virtue of the high-level conference you had, which you referred to this morning, that you be able to establish his bona fides. Isn't that correct?
We were doing our best to do so.
Right. And so it's in that area then, I would think that you would want to see the top interrogators, not only those expert at interrogating with reference to the Soviet Union, but also about events in the Soviet Union, such as Oswald, would be important to you to have him interrogated by.
Well, sir, I wasn't present at these interrogations, and I don't know the exact questions. I assume there's a record available someplace, but it seems to me that in posing this question this way to me, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. You're damned if you hold the fellow too long and treat him badly because you'd like to find out what he does know about Oswald, and you're damned the other way if you really haven't dug his teeth out to find out what he did know about Oswald. And I don't know, sir, the answer. If we had it to do over again, I don't know what we would do. Probably do it differently, I'm sure, but I don't know exactly how we would have arrived at truth in the space of time that we had available to us. You may recall from the record that Mr. Nosenko, at the time he defected and before, was a very heavy drinker. And one of the problems we had with him during his first period of time in the United States was that he didn't want to do anything except drink and carouse. We had trouble with him in an incident in Baltimore where he started punching up a bar and so forth. And that one of the reasons for wanting to hold him in confinement was to get him away from the booze and to settle him down and see if we could make some sense with him. And the fact that he may have been held too long is therefore deplorable, but nevertheless we were doing our best. It has been said, and I believe it's true, that in the latter days of his interrogation that Mr. Nosenko provided the agency with useful information with respect to certain Soviet activities. I do not recall that he gave them any additional information that helped to resolve the Oswald case or Oswald's status with the KGB. The reimbursement being given him here was for two purposes. One, to get him resettled in the United States. May I say that this was the only viable option left to us at that time. There was no way of deporting him to the Soviet Union. He would have been shot and killed when he got back. He would never have been able to explain to them what he was doing during the period that he was away. So we had only one option, and that was to try and resettle him. And this was what I had in mind to do, and he needed money and he needed employment. If you will study the history of Soviet defectors in this country, they have an extraordinarily difficult time adjusting to our society. They have a very difficult time making money and running businesses and being gainfully employed.
Mr. Helms, if I could just follow up at this point on an area that gives me some concern, and that is, if I understand you correctly, I believe you said you still, even today, don't really know whether Nosenko is bona fide or not. And furthers your recollection that you don't believe the agency ever arrived at that determination, particularly when you were there. Then let me ask you this. If it were clearly proven that Nosenko's statements concerning Oswald were untrue, what significance could you attach to such a finding insofar as the broader question of his overall bona fides is concerned?
I think, Mr. Stokes, that is just the point. And this is the issue which remains, as I understand it, to this very day, that no person familiar with the facts of whom I am aware finds Mr. Nosenko's comments about Lee Harvey Oswald and the KGB to be credible. That still hangs in the air like an incubus. And I think that, therefore, this tends to sour a great deal of one's opinion of all the other things that he may have contributed to the knowledge of the intelligence community about Soviet affairs and Soviet agents and so forth. And I don't know how one resolves this bone in the throat. And therefore, if I sit here before you and say, Mr. Stokes, I believe that Mr. Nosenko is a bona fide defector and that you can rely on everything he says, I am in effect saying to you, Mr. Stokes, you can rely on what he says about Lee Harvey Oswald, and I would not like to make that recommendation to you. And there is where this thing is a most difficult question, even at this late date.
Now, if just the basic Nosenko story were fundamentally disproved, without our taking the next step and saying that Oswald is a KGB agent, what significance would that have on the overall assessment of Nosenko's bona fides?
Mr. Stokes, I find this extraordinarily difficult to say. As one works this backward and forward, as you have been doing, and with great skill, it is, I find, rather dangerous for me to sort of jump from one assumption to another assumption and then extrapolate from these things to judgments which might be very alarming and which could not be demonstrated. And I'm sorry, and I recognize that it's absolutely central to the investigation of this committee, which has worked very long and very hard on this subject to try and resolve this issue, but I can give no more help than I've already given.
How would you characterize, by the way, your own reaction to this whole situation? Was this frustrating, or were you just content with going along with this whole period of time in which...
I don't think there's been anything more frustrating in my life. And this would have been resolved, I think, very rapidly if it involved anything except the assassination of President Kennedy. I don't suppose I'd be sitting here today if he hadn't been assassinated either.
Well, wouldn't it have been either responsibility of you or Mr. McCone to advise the commission of the extraordinary action being taken with reference to this?
But I don't think there was anything particularly extraordinary about the months during which the Warren Commission was sitting that he was undergoing.
Maybe you misunderstood my use of the word extraordinary. It seemed to me that the point you're getting ready to put a man in solitary confinement on the conditions under which he was confined, this is not a normal American situation. It was extraordinary.
I understand that.
And so I put it in that sense. Don't you think they should have been advised of this extraordinary situation?
But I think that these, is it not true? Maybe my recollection is faulty, but during the time that we were attempting to resolve his bona fides in order to help the Warren Commission, the fact that he was being kept alone and isolated and so forth, I didn't think would have come as a surprise to anyone. This is the way we handle all defectors.
That was standard operating procedure then, is that it?
Of course. What would you do with them? Put them in the Hilton?
Well, I've never been in that position, have put one anywhere, and hopefully never will. The conditions that we have just talked about obviously began April 4, 1964. Is that correct?
That's what you say, Mr. Stokes. I'm going to go with
Mr. Helms.
I'm going with your time schedule from now on. There's no sense in my getting all confused and delaying this hearing by this. I'll accept what you say, that it started in April 64.
You'll accept it. The report of the Warren Commission was not issued till December of that year, September of that year. It would seem to me that that would have been ample time for the Warren Commission to have been advised of the conditions under which a defector who professed to have important information about Oswald was being kept. And if I understand your testimony correctly, the Commission was not told of these conditions under which this defector was being kept.
I don't recall their having been told. They certainly knew that we had the defector in our custody, because that was the burden of what I told the Chief Justice. The precise circumstances under which he was being held, if they were identified to the Warren Commission, I'm not aware of it.
They identify here one period beginning prior to August 1960. That's the first one. And the second one is August 1960 to April of 61. The third being April of 61 to late 61.
Aren't those all the same one?
Well, that's my question for you. The Inspector General seemed to distinguish between the various phases here. And according to your testimony before us, that is this what you were referring to? Is this what you're calling one that they call five?
That's right. I became involved with this business sometime in 1962 after I took over as DDP. I've forgotten exactly what month. Anything prior to that I didn't have anything to do with. I would assume this was this one plot, but maybe there are others. But if they are, and all the time I spent with the church committee and all the time I've spent testifying endlessly for the last 3 or 4 years, it seems to me, about these matters, I haven't had anything else brought to my attention. If you gentlemen have something, I'd like to know it, but I don't know what it is, and I'm sorry I can't help.
Well, did you take issue with this report at the time it was issued 11 years ago?
Mr. Dodd, when I got this report, I had some problems with respect to reporting to President Johnson about certain points that he was particularly interested in with respect to this report. I did not attempt to parse it or analyze it or get it changed or to do anything with it except to use it as a fact-finding document. And I want to say right now that I never expected to see the document in the public domain declassified for the appetites of all those who wanted to make the most of it. And therefore, if I had known this, I obviously would have edited the report and changed it rather substantially, put it in the hands of the lawyers, and had it entirely rewritten.
Well, I'd say to you, Mr. Helms, with all due respect, it's not being put into evidence to satisfy the voracious appetites of anyone, but merely to try and clear up a point that we're trying to resolve here. And I hope you'd understand.
What is the point you'd like to resolve?
Well, as someone who's just confronted, I'm not an expert in these matters, but I read your transcript, and you said the only assassination plot that had any semblance of substance was the one involving a couple of mafia chiefs.
And that's what I believe to this day.
Okay, and I'm confronted with this document, an Inspector General's report, which was not written to satisfy the appetites of anyone. I presume it was a classified document. It says we can identify 5 separate phases. I'm merely asking you if you could clarify that in light of the earlier statement. That's the only purpose that this is being brought into testimony.
I'm sorry, but for example, it says here, that particular scheme. Which scheme? Is this the mafia thing that we're talking about?
That's correct.
I assume it is, and was again pushed vigorously in the era of Mongoose and in the climate of intense administration pressure on CIA to do something about Castro and his Cuba. Late 1962 and well into 63. Are we talking about the same mafia thing here as well? I mean, if that's a lot of plots, I regard as one and the same operation. And if I'm misleading you in some fashion or not...
Maybe I can help you. Is it one and the same in your mind because it involved Cuba and Fidel Castro? Since that was one and the same entity, that any efforts that were made to unsettle that might have been one effort.
The only one that I know about that was serious or that seemed to have been taken seriously was the one involving Roselli and Harvey. There were, as I believe the church committee brought out, there were found some a suit, a wetsuit, a clamshell, various things that were on the shelf in the agency that were regarded as things that might be used in possibly killing Castro or being used against him, which never came off the shelf, were never used. If that's a plot to have created this, then I will back up and say that then we ought to enumerate every single item that conceivably had to do with the invasions of Cuba, which we were constantly running. Under the government aegis, we had task forces that were striking at Cuba constantly. We were attempting to blow up power plants. We were attempting to ruin sugar mills. We were attempting to do all kinds of things during this period. This was a matter of American government policy. This wasn't the CIA. If those things taper over into assassination plots, maybe so, but I find the semantics in the English incendiary, but not very clear, and not very clarifying, and not very specific, that's all.
Mr. Helms, did John McCone, who was former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, as your immediate supervisor, and as the director of Central Intelligence, know about these, I gather you don't care for the word assassination plots, and I'm trying to find some words semantically that you and I can agree on here. Let's call them efforts to, so we say, get rid of Fidel Castro. How's that?
All right.
Does that satisfy you?
Fine.
All right. Did John McCone know about the agency's efforts to get rid of Fidel Castro?
Well, he certainly was on top of all the operations that we mounted against Cuba. He was in the vanguard of this. He attended all the committee meetings. He pushed certainly as hard as anyone in the administration to see if we couldn't topple the Castro regime. I believe that he has testified to the effect that he did not know of what he called a specific effort to kill Castro personally. I don't know whether he knew about it or not. I will accept his word. I have no reason to argue with him about it. There was a big flare-up at the time of the church committee hearings over whether I had told McCone about this or whether I had told Harvey not to say anything about it. I don't have any clear recollection anymore of the events surrounding that particular detail, so I can't help with it. I mean, I'd be glad to if I could.
So you don't know when he would have been informed?
No, and then I believe he had Mr. Elder, who was his executive assistant.
I'm having a hard time hearing. I apologize.
I'm sorry. Am I not close enough? Yeah. I'm sorry. During the church committee hearings, Mr. Elder, who was his executive assistant, swore out an affidavit that he had been instructed by McCone to tell me that anything smacking of assassination was not permissible to Mr. McCone. Mr. Elder gave this testimony under oath. I never had any conversation with Mr. Elder like that I ever recall. As I've said on previous occasions and on the record, I had a great regard for Mr. McCone. He was my boss. I would have no desire whatever if he had expressed himself in this fashion through one of his subordinates to me that I wouldn't have remembered it. I think I would have remembered it. So the issue is unresolved.
For the purposes of clarity, can we talk about these efforts to get rid of Fidel Castro in terms of pre-Bay of Pigs and post-Bay of Pigs? I think for our purposes that might be of some help.
Certainly.
Now, is it your testimony that Mr. McCone, I guess you said you didn't know, but let me restate it again and then you can answer again. Did I understand you to say that Mr. McCone, it's to your knowledge, you're not sure whether he knew about either the pre-Bay of Pigs or the post-Bay of Pigs efforts, or that he knew about the pre-Bay of Pigs and didn't know about the post-Bay of Pigs, Or that he knew about both?
I thought that on one occasion I told him about the pre-Bay of Pigs episode because my recollection is that something appeared in a newspaper, I think it was in the Chicago Sun-Times, about it, and I went and spoke to him about it and told him what was involved. As to the post-Bay of Pigs, I don't know what he knew. You know, Mr. Dodd, I'm not looking for refuge in these matters. I'm prepared to stand here and take my beating in any form that you gentlemen want to administer it.
Well, that's an assumption, because we're not out to beat anyone, I hear. We're just trying to get it.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that. But let me just explain that as director of the agency, Mr. McCone had every opportunity to find out anything in the agency that he wanted to find out. He had an inspection staff, he had executive assistants, he had all kinds of people around him. So what he knew and what he didn't know on any given day, I can't possibly attest to. But I do want to make the point that nobody was stopping him from finding out anything he wanted to find out.
Did you ever yourself, I guess you stated earlier you did not, you never talked with anyone on the Warren Commission or on its staff about any of these efforts to get rid of Castro or to overthrow the Cuban government?
But I might point out, in fairness to all concerned, that was not my function in those days, that if anybody was going to be briefing the Warren Commission about ongoing operations of any kind in the CIA, it would have been the director, or with the director's authority.
In light of all of that knowledge, in light of the obvious interest and emphasis that the entire U.S. government had on the possible activities of the Cuban government, in light of the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, with your knowledge at the time, after the fact, had engaged in these activities, why didn't you want to tell the Warren Commission, or why didn't you tell the Warren Commission about the efforts to get rid of Fidel Castro or to overthrow the Cuban government?
But Mr. Dodd, you're singling me out as to why I didn't march up and tell the Warren Commission when these operations against Cuba were known to the Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the President of the United States himself, although he at that point was dead. I mean, all kinds of people knew about these operations high up in the government. Now, why am I singled out as the fellow that should have gone up and identified a government operation to get rid of Castro? And it was a government-wide operation supported by the Defense Department, supported by the National Security Council, supported by almost everybody in high position in the government.
Well, according to earlier testimony, you made note of the fact, and I think the record indicates that the Attorney General had asked that they be stopped, and I presume was told they would be, so as far as he was concerned, they had ended.
What, some connection with the mafia? But the efforts to unseat Castro under Mongoose had gone on full blast under the Attorney General's direction. And we'd had the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. And if the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the connivance of Fidel Castro with the Soviet leaders, had been a success, those missiles would have been introduced into Cuba and the United States would have been hostage to the military might of the Soviet Union. It would have been the coup of the century. In December 1963, the brigade comes back from the Bay of Pigs, having been bought off by the Attorney General and various others with drug supplies and so forth. President Kennedy went to the Orange Bowl in Miami, greeted them in 1963, and assured them, and this may not be an exact quote, but it's pretty close, "I will return this banner to this brigade in a free Havana." Those operations went on non-stop during 1963. Now, if that doesn't indicate that there was some bad blood between President Kennedy and Fidel Castro, I don't know what does.
All right, but my point is this, that according to your testimony, Mr. McCone was not aware of the post-Bay of Pigs efforts and attempts. Robert Kennedy, the then Attorney General, had asked that all activities such as that be stopped. Mr. McCone is not aware. I can't ask you why they might not have, if others, that is they being others who had knowledge of this, didn't communicate it to the Warren Commission. But as I read your executive committee testimony, you felt you had not the link with the Warren Commission, but had a very active role in communicating with the Warren Commission. It doesn't help me in trying to understand why you wouldn't have made that information available and known to the Warren Commission.
Oh, I'm sorry I didn't.
In retrospect, you think it was relevant and should have been communicated?
In retrospect, Mr. Dodd, I would have done a lot of things very differently. And I'd like also to point out something, since we're so deeply into this. When one government is trying to upset another government and the operation is successful, people get killed. I don't know whether they're assassinated or whether they're killed in a coup. We had one recently in Afghanistan. The head of the Afghan government was killed. Was he assassinated or was he killed in a coup? I don't know. These semantics are all great. I simply want to say that there isn't a chief of state or a chief of government in the world today who is not aware of the fact that his life is in jeopardy. He takes every possible precaution to guard himself. And the relevance of one plot or another plot and its effect on the course of events, I would have a very hard time assessing, and I think you would too. And suppose that I had gone down and told them and had said, yes, you know, we tried to do this, how would it have altered the outcome of the Warren Commission proceedings?
Well, wasn't that really for the Warren Commission to determine that?
I think that is absolutely correct, but they didn't have that chance, apparently.
That's right. Prior to the
But I don't want to take the sole blame for the fact they didn't take that chance.
No, I'm not asking you to assume...
Well, the implication of the hearing is that.
Well, you have to take these things in entire context. This isn't the only hearing we're having. Was it a conscious decision on your part not to inform the Warren Commission, or was it just something that you didn't think should be done at the time?
It never occurred to me. We never talked to anybody outside the agency about covert operations of any kind. That perhaps was a mistake, except to the Senate and House committees to whom we reported.
But as I understand your statement earlier, you believe today that that was a mistake.
Oh, I think it was a mistake, no doubt about it. I think that we should have shoved the whole thing over. I would have backed up a truck and taken all the documents down and put them on the Warren Commission's desk.
I've come back again, and Mr. Helms, I suppose it's the constant difficulty I have. I can see and appreciate why you would feel that the defector's information was relevant. I can certainly see why the question of the reliability of Mr. Nosenko with regard to his information with regard to Oswald was relevant. And I have this terrible problem of trying to understand why, albeit today you recognize it was a mistake, but why when you, back in 1964 here, recognized the relevancy of those two pieces of information, there was a lack of understanding as to the relevancy of attempts on our part to destabilize or to get rid of Fidel Castro as not being relevant. That's the difficulty I have.
I can understand your difficulty, Mr. Dodd, and I'm just sorry it's an untidy world.
And it is further your testimony that President Johnson was aware of the so-called Amlash plot.
I believe I gave him what I recollect is a good fill-in on what we were trying to do. And the Amlash operation was a political action operation, an effort to get a political grouping together which could unseat Castro. I recognize that in one of the documents, because I noticed it the other day in this group of documents, some officer in the Cuban operations testified to the fact that was referred to consistently in the group as an assassination operation. That is not my recollection of the case. It was not an assassination operation or designed for that purpose. And I think that I do know what I'm talking about here, but there are other witnesses to that. Mr. Fitzgerald is dead, but there are other gentlemen who worked with him at the time.
But you would, based on your earlier testimony, it's semantics we have trouble with.
If you're the target, it's a great deal of difference whether somebody is thinking about doing something to you 10 miles from here and actually doing something to you. And if I don't mean to indulge too much in semantics, but it's a question of whether anything ever happened or not.
Well, that's not really the question. At this point here, we're talking about what was planned to have happened.
Well, you see, the Amlash operation was designed to try and get this man to organize a political action operation and a military operation to get rid of Castro. It was he who kept saying that the fastest way to do this is to kill the man. But this didn't mean that the agency was interested in that aspect of the thing, and the primary reason for being in touch with him was quite the opposite. We were trying to do various things to rein him in.
It wasn't suggested that there be a democratic election to unseat Castro.
I should say not, but if you go through the records of those years, you will find it was the whole United States government was behind this one.
Well, could you distinguish this one then from the other ones? You didn't really want to characterize these other efforts as assassination plots or efforts to single out and get rid of Castro. This one you describe as more of a political operation. I'm having a difficult time then distinguishing the earlier ones, if they are to be distinguished.
Well, I think it goes back, Mr. Dodd, to what I was saying a few minutes ago. The one government mounts operations to unseat another government. At what point does what word become what word? It's you are trying to unseat them, and you're trying to unseat them by the means at your disposal. And some may be shooting with guns. Other may be that they will take off and go to the hills. Others may be that you could arrest them and put them in jail. But you know this as well as I do. This is the history of the world. There are coups constantly going on. All I'm trying to say is the United States government had a policy for many months of trying to mount a coup against Fidel Castro.
Again, just to make sure I understood, your statement and testimony was that you didn't consider Amlash to be an assassination plot, or it was more of a political operation. Okay. But now, let me read, if I can, this section here where you identified the document. It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro. Now, I read this, and again, I'm reading from the same report that we read from earlier. They're calling it an assassination device. Are we getting semantical here again, or is...
No, I think the device that was a hypodermic with some kind of poison in it that...
I'm having a hard time again, Mr.
Oh, I'm
Helms.
sorry. I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it. This was in response to Amlash's request that he be provided some sort of a device whereby he could kill Castro. He returned this device to the case officer. The case officer brought it back to Washington, and that was the end of the plot.
Okay, but for purposes of discussion, the officer gave this Cuban, this agent in Paris, a device with that material you described in it. I presume the material, if injected into a human being, would kill him. Is that correct?
I would think so, yes.
So the agent gives the Cuban agent the device to kill somebody.
I'm sorry he didn't give him a pistol, because it would have made the whole thing a lot simpler and less exotic.
Well, whether it's a pistol or a needle, if Amlash is a political plot to destabilize the government, what in the blazes are we giving an agent a device that will kill Castro with for if it's not an assassination plot?
Well, if you want to have it that way, why don't you just have it that way?
Well, I don't want, it's not a question of what I want.
I think it is what you want, Mr. Dodd.
Mr. Helms, I'm reading to you from reports here, prepared at your request by the Inspector General.
I understand that.
I'm not fabricating this or creating out of all my...
I understand that.
I'm quoting.
I understand that.
Well, it's not a question of what I want. It's a question of what this committee would like to know, and the committee is not satisfied, I don't believe at this point, as to exactly what the characterization of Amlash was.
Well, I've told you what I believe the characterization of Amlash to be.
Well, how does that jive with this?
If because we gave him a gun or a hypodermic syringe or whatever the case may be at his request because he had aims on Castro, if that is your definition of an assassination plot, then have it that way. That's quite satisfactory with me.
But it is your characterization that would not be.
My characterization. He didn't accept the weapon, he gave it back. If if we'd given him a gun and he'd given it back, there was no way that he was going to make for an assassination or a murder with that particular device, was there?
Well, it's not a question so much of what he wanted to do, it's what we were trying to do. That's important, I think, in the context of the Warren Commission. That's what I'm driving at.
Is it important? I thought you had Mr. Cabela testifying that they never even knew he was in touch with the CIA, so how is it relevant even to the hearings of this committee, let alone the Warren Commission?
Well, I would suggest to you that it might be relevant if, in fact, Mr. Castro were aware of the fact that we were engaging in an activity designed to cause his early demise.
Well, if he didn't know it, he could have guessed it.
Mr. Helms, the fact that Oswald was in possession of information of some sort on U.S. radar equipment and radar operating procedures at the time he defected or attempted to defect to Russia in 1959 is of some interest to us. Some people claim that he might have had knowledge of the U-2 spy plane's performance characteristics as well, although that's less certain. But we are certain, at least, about the radar information. He told a State Department official, as you testified this morning, I believe, in Moscow in 1959, that he intended to give this information to the Soviets. Now, my question is, was the CIA aware of Oswald's defection and the extent of his radar training in 1959?
I don't know, Mr. Fithian. My impression was that we first heard of his defection to the Soviet Union through State Department channels. Having been a Marine and therefore a responsibility of the Navy Department, I think the agency would not have gotten very close to Mr. Oswald. They would not have regarded him as part of our responsibility.
Let me ask you a moral question. Not a legal question, not a practical question, but a moral question. Would you tell me and the members of this committee and maybe the American people, what possibly could have been the moral justification for the CIA entering into an alliance with the mafia?
There was none.
To execute the president.
I have apologized for this. I can't do any more than apologize on public television that it was an error in judgment on my part. There was great pressure on us at the time to try and find connections in Cuba. That for my part in this, and to the extent that I had anything to do with it, I was heart sorry. I can't do more than apologize.
I understand you correctly to say is that there was no moral justification for it.
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you, sir.
Did the agency ever conduct an investigation to determine whether Lee Harvey Oswald had been connected with the CIA?
Yes, and I believe that Mr. McCone presented to the Warren Commission a sworn affidavit saying that he had no formal connection with the CIA of any kind. I gather that through the years, a couple of people have been identified who had once thought that maybe the agency should have some kind of a contact with Lee Harvey Oswald, but to the best of my knowledge, no contact was made. In any event, he was not an agent of the CIA, and I was horrified this morning to have Mr. Blakey, as a part of this commission's work, coming out with the allegation at this late date that he had some identification with the agency. Can't this ever be put to rest? What does it take to put it? Excuse me, I'm asking you a question. I will rephrase it. I would hope that at some juncture, someone would find some means of putting this allegation to rest. But I can assure you that we would not have asked or suggested or allowed Mr. McCone to swear out an affidavit, present it to the Warren Commission, unless we believe the affidavit to be truthful.
Was a written report filed summarizing the results of the agency's investigation?
I don't know.
Well, do you think one should have been filed?
I don't think so.
Why not, sir?
I don't have any idea why it should have. If it manifested itself in the affidavit that Mr. McCone swore out, isn't that enough evidence of the agency's position? I don't know how much evidence you need.
Are the agency's files sufficiently accurate to resolve that issue?
I don't know. You know, after this inquiry today, I'm reminded of the fact that back in the days of the Continental Congress, that intelligence, espionage, and counterespionage was conducted by committees of the Continental Congress. I think maybe the best thing to do would be to return secret intelligence to the aegis of the United States Congress and let you fellas run it.
Mr. Helms, did the agency ever have an operational interest in Lee Harvey Oswald?
Not that I'm aware of.
I would ask that the witness be shown JFK F526.
The memorandum doesn't say anything about a contact.
Does the memorandum make reference to the laying of interviews?
To the what?
To the laying of interviews.
Yes, it says, I had discussed sometime in Summers 1960 with almost a whole line blank, the laying on of interviews through blank or other suitable channels. At the moment, I don't recall if this was discussed while Oswald and his family were en route to our country or if it was after their arrival. What?
I've not asked you to read the document. I simply asked you if it makes reference...
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was disobeying.
I simply asked you to indicate whether or not the document makes reference to the laying of interviews.
Yes, it says, I thought about laying on an interview.
And in light of that, does the memorandum suggest that, at the very least, a contact with Oswald was contemplated by the agency?
Not by the agency, by some individual in the agency. And for a lawyer, I think you ought to be more precise.
Mr. Helms, I'm not in a position here today to respond to your criticism.
I'm sorry, I was no criticism.
Mr. Helms, have you testified before at a congressional hearing?
At any time?
Yes, sir.
You mean in my life?
Yes, sir.
On more than one occasion, yes.
And during those occasions, sir, was the standard operating procedure for the attorney to ask questions and for the witness to answer them?
I must confess during my life, Mr. Goldsmith, that I was usually asked questions by the senators or the congressmen involved.
Very well, Mr. Helms. Under those circumstances, again, was the procedure for the member of the committee or its staff to ask the questions and to have the witness answer the questions?
Yes.
Did anyone tell you before you came to testify here today that that procedure would not be followed?
I don't recall discussing it with anyone.
Fine, then let's follow the standard operating procedure, Mr. Helms.
Certainly, Mr. Goldsmith.
Did the agency debrief Lee Harvey Oswald upon his return from the Soviet Union?
I was not aware if it did. I don't believe it did.
Would standard operating procedure have called for Oswald to have been debriefed?
I would not have thought so, Mr. Goldsmith. I think that the standing operating procedure when he returned to the United States would have been for the Navy to debrief him.
And why is that, sir?
Because he had been a member of the Marine Corps, and I believe he stayed in the Marine Reserve, if I'm not mistaken. But in any event, the understandings were that military officers were handled by the intelligence organs of the defense establishment.
So I take it then that the agency had no interest in finding out whatever information Oswald may have picked up during his work at a radio factory in Minsk?
I think that they would have hoped that they would have got that information from the Navy.
And did the agency ever obtain that information from the Navy?
I don't know.
Again, Mr. Helms, would you agree that a memorandum that makes reference to the possibility of laying up interviews on Oswald is contemplating a contact with Oswald? I'm not suggesting the contact necessarily occurred, sir, but that it's contemplating a contact.
Apparently someone, and I'm sorry, but the memorandum is so sanitized that I don't know who it was, nor do I know in what part of the agency he was, apparently had an idea at some point that maybe it would be a good idea to interview Oswald. To the best of my knowledge, his thought never came to anything.
Did the agency ever interview the author of this memorandum to determine whether there was any follow-up?
I don't know. I don't know who wrote the memorandum.
Do you think if there were a written report summarizing what the agency had done in its investigation of the Oswald agency allegation, that perhaps issues like this might more readily be resolved?
I don't know. I think these issues are very difficult to resolve, particularly 15 years later when I don't even know what I'm dealing with.
Do you think that the availability of a written report summarizing the steps that the agency went through would facilitate resolving this issue today?
Yes, I think probably it would have been, in light of hindsight, it might have been very useful if we had had a memorandum for the record of everybody in the agency who was talked to about Oswald. We should have kept that going for several years.
Why would the agency have opened a 201 file on Oswald?
Why would it have?
Yes, sir.
Well, I believe at some point a decision must have been made that Oswald was perhaps a matter of continuing interest, and therefore the information which we held on him should be put in a file. I would like to suggest to the committee that when a government agency receives mail, it has to do something with it. And one of the things that you do with it is to try and categorize the type of information it is and where it would best be filed so that if you need it at some future date, you can get it back.
Mr. Helms, in whose name was this 201 file opened?
The name is Oswald Lee and the middle name Henry.
Did the agency ever...
Excuse me, I stated 9 December 1960. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure I could read it.
Did the agency ever initiate inquiry as to why the file in Oswald was opened under middle name Henry instead of Harvey?
I don't know the answer to that, Mr. Goldsmith. I believe that it caused a great deal of controversy at the time that it was discovered after President Kennedy's death. But what the resolution of the matter was and whether any logical explanation was found, I don't know.
Did you ever see a written report dealing with this issue?
If there was one, I don't recall seeing it, but I have no doubt that somebody must have made an effort to explain it.
Now, you made reference earlier to the date of this particular document. It's 9 December 1960. The State Department telegram, which we showed you earlier, was dated October 31st, 1959. That's the document that made reference to Oswald intending to defect and to give military information to the Soviets. Why, after the receipt of this State Department telegram in October of 59, would it have taken more than a year to have opened the 201 file on Oswald?
I have no explanation for that, Mr. Goldsmith. I'm sorry, I just don't know.
Mr. Helms, are 201 files ever maintained on a covert basis? Or is there ever such a thing, for example, as a fake 201 file?
I don't know. You brought to my attention the fact that you had discovered one in the agency. I was not aware of the phenomenon myself prior to your having brought it to my attention. But since you did find one, then I must concede that I guess there was such a thing, but I was not aware of the one that you brought to my attention, and I'm not aware of any others.
Now, it would just seem to me that after what you people did to Nosenko here in this country, without any color of law at all, that you really only had two choices. One was to dispose of him, as suggested.
That was never considered, Mr. Sawyer.
Well, I'm talking about what your division chief for the Soviet bloc wrote down that was being considered. At least by him.
He was the deputy division chief, and maybe he did write this down, but I say that these things were never brought to my attention. The suggestion was never made to me. This was never an option that was considered.
Well, look, you testified about your considering assassinating people along with the mafia. It's nothing new to you people, apparently, to assassinate somebody.
That's your statement, Mr. Sawyer.
Well, I thought that's what you've been testifying to here about willingly becoming a party to an assassination either by syringe, by gun, or by poison pills of Castro. So once we get in the acceptance of that line, it doesn't seem to me so out of line that would be one of the things you'd consider. And apparently your deputy division chief did consider it. Now, it seemed to me the only other option would be to pay him off handsomely enough so he would keep quiet about this when you let him go. You obviously couldn't deport him very well at this point in time. And it just appears to me, as I look at it, that it's perfectly plain that you exercised the option of paying him off. Now, do you dispute that?
Yes, I dispute it.
So you say you paid over a period of time some $500,000 is about what it amounts to as I quickly add it up, both in lump sum payments and in monthly stipends, to a guy that the agency never decided wasn't in fact there to mislead it and give it false information. You pay it that as a consultant, and you say the motivation was not at all to pay him off. Is that your position?
No, sir, I'm counting to 10. That was what my mother taught me to do under these circumstances.
You're doing what?
I'm counting to 10. This is what my mother taught me to do under these circumstances.
It takes that long.
The effort in Mr. Nosenko's case, and the only option that we had available to us, in my opinion, was to resettle him and give him a new identity and handle him in such a way that he would have a chance to make a life for himself on the American scene. It has been 5 years since I had anything to do with his pay. I don't know what's been done to him since.
You said, you couldn't just put him out on welfare. Well, what do we do with most immigrants that come in, either from Indochina, that are in effect refugees, or regularly admitted immigrants? We may provide them some educational help in the language or that sort of thing, but we don't pay them off. And here you're talking about sums of money that wouldn't be mentionable in the same breath as welfare. And I just say, as I look at this thing, it just, taking all these facts that you've testified to into account, it would just seem to me, on the face of it, it was a payoff. And I'm surprised to hear you deny it.
I believe that under the Constitution you're entitled to your viewpoint and I'm entitled to mine.
Well, you did in fact plead guilty to having withheld information from a Senate committee, didn't you?
No, sir, I did not.
I thought you had.
I did not. I pleaded nolo contendere.
Oh, so that you just don't contest it then, which is the legal equivalent of a plea of guilty, is correct? Except that it can't be used as an admission against you in the civil case, isn't that right?
I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Sawyer.
No, but I'm sure you were advised by lawyers before you entered a nolo contendere. Were you not?
I was advised by lawyers.
You said, too, that, you didn't subject Nosenko to physical abuse. Well, as I've both talked to Nosenko and listened to the CIA official spokesman define it, it was a partial starvation, a being subjected to cold weather without even so much as being provided a blanket, not being allowed fresh air during the heat of the summer for over a year. Don't you consider that, just those items alone, as being physical torture, actually?
I cannot verify those items. I don't know whether they're true or not. You've told me today that they were true.
Well, you were the man in charge when he had been without any legal process or trial, just incarcerated in solitary confinement. You were in charge of the agency that was doing that, weren't you?
No, I wasn't in charge at that time.
Well, during part of that time you were.
I became in charge later.
Well, during part of that time you were, weren't you?
Is there any evidence that when I was the director that these things had happened to him? I don't know. I don't know anything about the time. I hear conflicting stories about how he was treated. You'll have to use your stories. I can use mine.
But as you said of McCone, he could have found out anything in the agency that he wanted to find out. You said that right here. Do you remember?
I said that, indeed.
So I presume, being one of the people in charge of this having occurred to the man, you could have found out anything about what was happening to him that you wanted to, couldn't you?
I never was told any tales that...
Did you know? Well, you knew he was in your custody.
That's correct. I did, sir.
And you never made any inquiry about what was happening to him over this 4 or 5 year period?
Of course I did.
Well, did you find out then what they were doing to him? What you were doing to him?
I was never told of these details of his being kept in a room that was so hot that he couldn't stand it or any of those things. Those were never brought to my attention, or I never got those in answer to any inquiry. And if this is the truth, I'm genuinely sorry about it, but I was not aware of it at the time.
When you were interviewed apparently by a Mr. Lardner, George Lardner of the Washington Post, after your executive testimony here, said in effect to him that, quote, and I quote as you're quoted in that article, and the article is in the Washington Post of Thursday, August the 10th, referring to your appearance here on August the 9th, said, quote, you said to Lardner, quote, your questions are almost as dumb as the committee's, end quote. Does that rather fairly reflect your general opinion and attitude toward congressional
talking to Mr. Lardner after the hearing the other time. I was chatting in the hall with the newspapermen around lunchtime. I don't recall making as acerbic a remark as that, and of course I withdraw it, if I did make it.
You don't think...
I never even saw the article, so it must have been in the first edition of the Washington Post. The article I saw the next day didn't have anything like that in it.
But you don't
It teaches you never to talk to the press. I mean, that's the only lesson it does. If they quoted me accurately, if they didn't quote me accurately, then I shouldn't have made off-the-cuff remarks. But I don't feel that way. I think this inquisition has been admirably handled.
Well, here, if you didn't read the article, let me give you the benefit of the appropriate or the applicable part of it. It says, Helms told reporters during a break that no one would ever know who or what Lee Harvey Oswald, named by the Warren Commission as Kennedy's assassin, represented. Asked whether the CIA knew of any ties Oswald had with either the KGB or the CIA, Helms paused and said with a laugh, quote, I don't remember. Pressed on the point, he told a reporter, your questions are almost as dumb as the committee's. You don't recall any such statement?
I recall an exchange about Oswald because I don't think we are ever going to find out what Lee Harvey Oswald's role was until we get the Russian KGB files. That was all. That was what I was referring to.
Now, there was you did allude to the representation in Mr. McCone's letter or affidavit that there was no formal connection between Lee Harvey Oswald and the CIA. Did that, by the use of the word formal, did you intend to exclude any other type of relationship or contact?
No, Mr. Sauer, I'm sorry. I was trying to use a shortcut, I think, but in the documents that I was given in preparation or before this hearing, the actual affidavit of Mr. McCone is there present, and I think should be permitted to stand on its own feet. In other words, I would not want to say that I was attempting to add or subtract from it.
Are you, in your long time with the agency, have you ever known of any example where anything remotely similar to what was done to Nosenko was done to someone else here in this country?
No, I know of no other case comparable, nor do I know of any other case that ever confronted us where a man might have information having to do with the assassination of a president of the United States. So the answer is, to your question specifically, is I know of no other case, and I believe there never was one.
But whereas I recognize your disclaimer of being a lawyer, you certainly know that the police, even with the assassin himself, could never have done anything like this, would never have been permitted to do anything like this. You understand people's rights enough for that, don't you?
Oh, yes, I understand people's rights.
I mean, holding a man in solitary confinement under these kind of conditions without a trial and subjecting him to both physical and mental torture Even with the assassin himself, there's no way the laws of our country permit that kind of thing. You knew that, didn't you?
Well, I rather thought that the legal status of Mr. Nosenko in those days was in a very gray area, and if I'm wrong about it, I wish you would correct me now, Mr. Sawyer, because I'm prepared to be corrected.
Well, he was a human being, wasn't he?
I believe so.
You know, in most states, even treating an animal like this will land you in jail. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.